Many people spend years believing their life would finally become easier if just a few people around them would change, if a loved one became more responsible, if a friend made better choices, if a family member finally understood what they have been trying to say all along, and so they devote enormous amounts of time and emotional energy to a battle they can never truly win. They replay conversations in their minds, search for the perfect words, offer advice that was never asked for, carry worries that do not belong to them. Then one day they look around and notice something unsettling. The people they were trying to change are largely the same, but they themselves have become exhausted. The Stoics understood this long before psychology began describing it. The fastest way to lose your peace is to place it in the hands of another person. The moment your happiness depends on someone else's choices, habits, or growth, you surrender authority over your inner world. Yet most people never realize they are doing this. They call it helping. They call it caring. They call it love. But beneath all of it is a quiet struggle against reality itself. A struggle that slowly drains attention, energy, and peace from the only life they can actually govern. What makes this pattern so dangerous is that it rarely looks harmful in the beginning. It looks like responsibility. It looks like loyalty. It looks like compassion. Yet somewhere along the way, concern turns into attachment. Care turns into control. And without realizing it, a person can spend years waiting for someone else's life to become acceptable before allowing themselves to fully live their own. Most people never make a conscious decision to spend years trying to change the people around them. It rarely begins as a mission. It begins as concern. Someone you care about keeps making choices that seem to hurt them. Someone continues repeating the same mistakes despite the consequences. You see potential they are not using, opportunities they are ignoring, habits that seem to be leading them in the wrong direction. Because you care, you pay attention. Because you pay attention, you start offering advice. At first, it feels harmless. A suggestion here, a conversation there, a reminder, an observation, a gentle push in what appears to be the right direction. The intention is usually sincere. There is no desire to control, only the hope that someone you value might avoid unnecessary pain. Yet many of the patterns that eventually drain us do not arrive looking destructive. They arrive disguised as virtues. Responsibility becomes interference. Compassion becomes obsession. Concern becomes a burden that quietly reshapes the way you experience your own life. What makes this pattern so difficult to recognize is that it often feels morally justified. Caring about people is generally considered a good thing. Looking out for others is seen as a sign of loyalty and love. Few people stop to examine the hidden assumption beneath that instinct. The assumption that your peace will improve when the other person improves. Not immediately, not consciously, but gradually, the mind begins linking the two together. If they become more responsible, life will become easier. If they become more disciplined, there will be less stress. If they become more self-aware, there will be fewer conflicts. If they finally understand what you have been trying to explain, everything will settle into place. Without realizing it, your emotional well-being becomes connected to circumstances completely outside your authority. This is where frustration begins to take root. Not because the other person is necessarily doing something wrong, but because you have entered into an unwinnable arrangement with reality. Your peace depends on their choices. Your calm depends on their growth. Your sense of progress depends on their willingness to change. The Stoics understood this long before psychology began describing it. They knew that suffering often begins when we become attached to outcomes we cannot command. Influence is not control. Another person's decisions may affect your life, but they do not belong to you. Their thoughts belong to them. Their habits belong to them. Their priorities belong to them. The moment you forget this distinction, you begin carrying a weight that was never meant for your shoulders. Yet the mind rarely accepts this immediately. It keeps searching for the perfect argument, the perfect example, the perfect moment of clarity that will finally make the other person see what seems obvious to us. Every failed attempt creates the same illusion, that one more conversation will finally change everything. Maybe the timing was wrong, maybe the explanation was incomplete, maybe they simply need one more opportunity to understand. And so the cycle continues. More effort, more analysis, more emotional investment, yet the outcome remains largely unchanged. What began as concern slowly becomes expectation, and expectation inevitably creates tension whenever reality refuses to cooperate. Then something subtle begins to happen. Conversations stop feeling like conversations. They start feeling like evaluations. You listen not to understand, but to assess progress. Every interaction becomes evidence. Evidence of progress, or evidence that nothing has changed. Good news feels encouraging because it suggests movement. Disappointing news feels frustrating because it suggests stagnation. The relationship gradually becomes filtered through a lens of correction. Even moments that should create connection become opportunities to measure change. This is why so many people feel emotionally exhausted despite believing they are helping. Their attention is no longer in the present. It is fixed on a future version of another person, a version that may never exist. The cost of this is larger than most people realize. When your focus becomes consumed by someone else's development, your own life quietly moves into the background. Energy that could be invested in your character, your discipline, your goals, your health, and your growth is redirected elsewhere. Hours disappear into worry, days disappear into frustration, years disappear into waiting for someone else to become the person you believe they should be. Meanwhile, your own opportunities remain untouched. This is one of the reasons the Stoics placed such emphasis on returning attention to oneself. Not out of selfishness, but out of practicality. The only life you can directly shape is your own. Perhaps the most difficult realization is that the suffering does not come from the other person's refusal to change. It comes from the belief that they must. Once that belief takes hold, every setback feels personal. Every disappointment feels significant. Every repeated mistake feels like an obstacle standing between you and peace. Yet peace was never waiting on the other side of their transformation. Peace was waiting on the other side of your acceptance. As Epictetus observed, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. The acceptance that another human being possesses their own mind, their own path, and their own timeline. The acceptance that growth cannot be forced, borrowed, negotiated, or imposed. It can only be chosen. There is another reason this habit becomes so consuming, and it is not always easy to see because it often disguises itself as responsibility. When attention is constantly directed toward another person's behavior, there is very little room left to examine our own. The mind becomes occupied. It has a project to work on, a problem to solve, a situation to monitor. On the surface, this feels productive. There is effort involved. There is concern involved. There is emotional investment involved. Yet effort alone does not guarantee progress. A person can spend years thinking intensely about someone else's life while making almost no movement in their own. This is one of the most subtle traps a person can fall into. The mind confuses concern with contribution, observation with action, emotional involvement with meaningful growth. Someone can spend hours discussing another person's problems and feel exhausted by the end of the day. The exhaustion convinces them they have been working hard. In a sense, they have. But what has actually improved? Exhaustion is not always evidence of progress. Sometimes it is simply evidence that energy has been spent. The destination matters just as much as the effort. Energy directed toward what cannot be controlled rarely produces the results we hope for. This becomes even more complicated because the process often feels virtuous. People tell themselves they are helping, supporting, caring too much to look away. Yet the desire to fix others sometimes protects us from the discomfort of fixing ourselves. Looking inward requires honesty. It requires confronting areas of life where improvement is needed. It requires acknowledging mistakes, weaknesses, and missed opportunities. By comparison, focusing on another person's flaws feels easier. Their shortcomings are visible. Their mistakes seem obvious. Their problems create a narrative that keeps attention moving away from the work that truly belongs to us. If these ideas resonate, consider subscribing. To keep returning to principles that have helped people strengthen character, navigate uncertainty, and see life more clearly for centuries. Sometimes a single insight, reflected on deeply enough, can change the direction of an entire life. This is one of the most subtle psychological traps a person can fall into. The mind confuses concern with contribution. It confuses observation with action. It confuses emotional involvement with meaningful growth. Someone can spend hours thinking about a family member's decisions, discussing a friend's problems, or worrying about a partner's future. At the end of the day, they feel mentally exhausted. The exhaustion convinces them they have been working hard. In a sense, they have. But what has actually improved? Exhaustion is not always evidence of progress. Sometimes it is simply evidence that energy has been spent. The destination matters just as much as the effort. Energy directed toward what cannot be controlled rarely produces the results we hope for. This becomes even more complicated because the process often feels virtuous. A person tells themselves they are helping. They tell themselves they are being supportive. They tell themselves they care too much to simply walk away from the problem. These explanations may be partially true, but they can also conceal something deeper. The desire to fix others sometimes provides protection from the discomfort of fixing ourselves. Looking inward requires honesty. It requires confronting areas of life where improvement is needed. It requires acknowledging mistakes, weaknesses, and neglected opportunities. That kind of examination can be uncomfortable. It can expose things we would rather not see. By comparison, focusing on another person's flaws feels easier. Their shortcomings are visible. Their mistakes seem obvious. Their problems create a narrative that keeps attention moving away from the areas of life where genuine personal work is required. This does not mean concern for others is wrong. The issue is not compassion. The issue is imbalance. There is a difference between caring about someone and becoming consumed by them. One comes from generosity. The other often comes from attachment. When attachment takes over, another person's growth begins to feel more important than our own. Their choices determine our mood. Their progress determines our optimism. Their setbacks determine our frustration. Gradually, a strange reversal occurs. The person trying to help becomes emotionally dependent on outcomes they cannot influence. Instead of strengthening their own foundation, they spend their days monitoring someone else's. It feels noble from the inside, but the consequences are often destructive. What makes this pattern particularly dangerous is that it can continue for years without attracting attention. The mind becomes accustomed to it. Worry feels normal. Monitoring feels normal. Constant analysis feels normal. Over time, these habits blend into everyday life until they no longer appear unusual. Yet beneath the surface, something important is being neglected. Personal growth requires sustained attention. Character does not strengthen by accident. Discipline does not develop through wishful thinking. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Clarity does not emerge from endless observation of other people. These things require direct engagement with one's own life. They require effort directed inward rather than outward. Every hour spent managing someone else's journey is an hour unavailable for your own. There is a revealing question hidden beneath all of this. If all the energy currently invested in changing another person were suddenly returned, where would it go? Most people instinctively know the answer. It would go toward unfinished goals. It would go toward neglected habits. It would go toward health, learning, relationships, purpose, and growth. It would go toward the parts of life that quietly wait for attention while the mind remains occupied elsewhere. The realization can be uncomfortable because it exposes a difficult truth. Sometimes the reason another person's problems feel so important is that they distract us from challenges we have not yet chosen to face ourselves. The Stoics often emphasized that attention is one of the most valuable resources a person possesses. Where attention goes, life follows. Whatever receives repeated focus gradually shapes perception, emotion, and behavior. If attention is constantly invested in another person's choices, then much of life becomes organized around circumstances outside personal control. But when attention returns to what can actually be influenced, something changes. The mind becomes less scattered, energy becomes more purposeful. The endless cycle of observation and frustration begins to weaken. What once felt like responsibility starts to reveal itself as something else entirely. Not malice, not selfishness, simply avoidance wearing a respectable disguise. And once that disguise is recognized, it becomes much harder to mistake constant concern for meaningful progress. Perhaps this is why resentment so often appears where love once seemed to be the dominant force. It does not arrive suddenly, it does not announce itself. It develops quietly in the background while a person continues investing time, effort, attention, and emotional energy into changing someone who has not chosen to change. At first, there is patience, then there is concern. After that comes frustration. Eventually, a subtle sense of entitlement begins to emerge, not necessarily entitlement in the usual sense, but the belief that so much effort should produce some visible result. The conversations should matter, the advice should matter, the sacrifices should matter, the care should matter. When months or years pass and the desired changes fail to appear, disappointment begins accumulating beneath the surface. The disappointment is rarely directed at the original problem alone. It slowly attaches itself to the person. Without realizing it, a relationship that was built on affection begins carrying the weight of expectation. This shift is easy to understand from a psychological perspective. Human beings naturally seek a return on investment. Whenever time, energy, or emotion is poured into something, the mind starts looking for evidence that the investment is worthwhile. This tendency serves a useful purpose in many areas of life. Effort often does produce results. Discipline strengthens the body. Practice develops skill. Consistent action moves goals forward. But relationships operate differently. Another person's growth does not follow the same rules. There is no direct correlation between the amount of effort you invest and the amount of change they produce. Yet many people continue behaving as though such a relationship exists. They believe that enough patience, enough guidance, enough encouragement, or enough persistence will eventually create the outcome they want. When reality refuses to cooperate, frustration naturally follows because the mind struggles to accept that some outcomes simply cannot be purchased with effort. Most people do not respond well to living under those conditions. Even individuals who genuinely want to improve need space to remain human. They need room to make mistakes, to learn at their own pace, and to arrive at conclusions through their own understanding. Constant evaluation creates tension because it transforms the relationship into something resembling a performance review. Every action feels observed, every decision feels measured, every setback feels noticed. Over time, this creates emotional distance, not necessarily because there is hostility, but because there is discomfort. Few people enjoy feeling like they are permanently falling short of someone else's expectations. The natural response is often withdrawal. They become less open, less communicative, less willing to share what is happening in their lives. The relationship begins losing the sense of safety that once allowed honesty to flourish. What makes this particularly painful is that the person doing the fixing often feels confused by the outcome. They believe they have been generous. They believe they have been patient. They believe they have been acting out of love. In many cases, all of those things are true. Yet love mixed with constant correction can produce unintended consequences. The problem is not the presence of care. The problem is the inability to separate care from control. Genuine care allows another person the dignity of choice. Control attempts to direct those choices toward a preferred outcome. The line between the two can become surprisingly difficult to see, especially when intentions remain sincere. Many people spend years crossing that line without realizing it because they are focused entirely on the destination and not on the experience of the person walking beside them. This is why so many relationships become trapped in cycles that seem impossible to resolve. One person continues pushing, the other continues pulling away. More pressure is applied, more resistance appears. Both individuals become frustrated, both feel misunderstood, both believe they are acting reasonably, yet neither recognizes the deeper issue beneath the surface. The struggle is no longer about the original problem. It has become a struggle over ownership. Ownership of choices, ownership of growth, ownership of direction. The more one person attempts to claim that ownership, the more fiercely the other tends to protect it. Eventually, a difficult realization begins to emerge. No amount of effort grants authority over another person's path. Their lessons remain theirs. Their mistakes remain theirs. Their growth remains theirs. Accepting this can feel uncomfortable because it requires surrendering the illusion of influence that many people have carried for years. Yet it also creates something valuable. It creates freedom. The moment another person's development stops being treated as a personal responsibility, resentment begins losing its fuel, expectations begin softening, relationships begin breathing again. What remains is not indifference, and it is not withdrawal, it is respect. Respect for the reality that every human being must ultimately decide for themselves who they will become, and no amount of love can make that decision on their behalf. This is why so many attempts to force growth end in frustration. The effort focuses on the wrong part of the process. It focuses on supplying answers when the real barrier is readiness. Readiness cannot be given from the outside. It develops internally through experience, reflection, consequences, and personal realization. Every human being arrives at these moments on their own timeline. Some arrive quickly, others take years, some never arrive at all. As Socrates observed, "I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think." This can be difficult to accept because it challenges the comforting belief that enough effort can solve every problem. In reality, there are limits to influence. You can offer perspective, you can provide support, you can share what you have learned, but you cannot decide when another person is prepared to hear it. That decision belongs entirely to them. The irony is that accepting this often creates better relationships. Pressure begins to disappear. Conversations become lighter. People stop feeling managed and start feeling respected. Instead of interacting with a project that needs improvement, they interact with a person who accepts their freedom to choose. That acceptance creates space. Sometimes it even creates the conditions where growth becomes more likely, not because anyone is pushing, but because resistance has less reason to exist. Human beings naturally protect their autonomy. The more they feel controlled, the more they defend it. The more they feel respected, the more open they often become. This does not mean becoming indifferent. It does not mean withdrawing care or refusing to help when help is needed. Guidance still has value. Support still matters. Wisdom shared at the right moment can change a life. The difference is that guidance is offered without attachment. Support is given without demands. Wisdom is shared without insisting that it be accepted. There is a calmness in that approach because it recognizes where responsibility ends. You can offer a map, but you cannot walk the path for another person. You can point toward a door, but you cannot make someone open it. You can illuminate possibilities, but you cannot choose on their behalf. One of the reasons people remain trapped in this pattern for so long is that letting go feels dangerous. On an intellectual level, they may understand that they cannot control another person's choices. They may agree that every individual is responsible for their own life. Yet when the moment arrives to stop intervening, stop monitoring, and stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs, a deep sense of fear often appears. The mind immediately begins creating scenarios. What if things get worse? What if nobody steps in? What if the person continues making mistakes? What if they never change? These concerns can feel reasonable because they are usually connected to people we genuinely care about. The fear is not rooted in cruelty, it is rooted in attachment. We become attached to the belief that our involvement is preventing disaster, and because of that belief, stepping back feels almost irresponsible. The problem is that this fear often exaggerates our actual influence. It quietly assumes that we are far more responsible for another person's development than we truly are. It assumes that their progress depends primarily on our effort. It assumes that without our guidance, reminders, corrections, and constant attention, everything will begin falling apart. Yet when examined honestly, this belief gives us a role that no human being was ever meant to carry. It places another person's future on our shoulders. It turns concern into obligation and care into management. Over time, the weight becomes enormous, not because life is inherently heavy, but because we have added responsibilities that do not belong to us. We begin carrying multiple lives at once while struggling to manage our own. This creates an important realization. The issue is not a lack of energy. Most people have far more energy than they realize. The issue is where that energy is being directed. Energy follows attention. Attention follows priority. If attention is permanently focused on the behavior of others, then personal growth naturally receives less of it. There are only so many hours in a day, only so much mental bandwidth available. Every moment spent trying to govern someone else's choices is a moment unavailable for improving your own. As Seneca wrote, it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. This is why so many people feel stuck despite constantly feeling occupied. Their effort is genuine, but it is aimed at a target they cannot truly influence. The Stoics understood this distinction with remarkable clarity. They recognized that meaningful improvement begins with self-governance. Before attempting to shape the world around you, you must learn to shape your own responses. Before correcting another person's habits, you must examine your own. Before worrying about someone else's discipline, you must strengthen your own discipline. This was never presented as an act of selfishness. Quite the opposite. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The area where effort consistently produces results is the area where you possess authority. The mind, the character, the actions you choose each day. These belong to you. They can be developed, refined, strengthened, and improved through consistent effort. That is where progress lives. Imagine taking all the energy currently spent trying to manage another person's life and redirecting it toward your own development. Imagine investing that attention into health, learning, purpose, emotional stability, discipline, and meaningful work. Imagine what happens after 1 year. Then imagine 5 years, then 10. The difference becomes difficult to ignore. 10 years spent attempting to transform another person may produce little or nothing. 10 years spent refining yourself almost guarantees visible change. Skills improve, character deepens, confidence grows, opportunities expand. Life begins moving in a different direction because effort is finally being invested where effort can create results. Yet many people hesitate to make this shift because it feels uncomfortable at first. When attention is no longer consumed by someone else's problems, a strange emptiness can appear. The mind suddenly encounters open space. There is less to monitor, less to analyze, less to worry about. For someone accustomed to carrying others, that silence can feel unfamiliar. Sometimes it even feels wrong. The urge to return to old patterns appears quickly. The urge to check, advise, intervene and manage begins pulling attention outward once again. This is often the moment where genuine growth starts, not because the discomfort itself is valuable, but because it reveals how dependent the mind had become on external concerns. The ability to remain with that discomfort is transformative. Instead of immediately filling the space with someone else's problems, you begin filling it with your own responsibilities. Not in a self-critical way, but in a constructive one. Attention gradually returns to unfinished goals, neglected habits, personal standards, areas of life that have quietly waited for care and effort. The energy that once disappeared into endless observation begins producing visible progress. Small improvements accumulate, momentum develops. The sense of helplessness that often accompanies attempts to change others starts fading because attention is finally directed towards something responsive. This is where a profound shift takes place. You stop measuring your effectiveness by your ability to influence other people. You start measuring it by your ability to govern yourself. The focus moves from outcomes you cannot control to actions you can. The endless struggle to manage another person's journey begins losing its appeal because a more meaningful challenge has appeared. Your own growth, your own character, your own life. And unlike the battles fought inside someone else's mind, this is one where effort has the power to create genuine and lasting change. Something unexpected begins to happen when you finally stop carrying responsibilities that were never yours in the first place. Most people assume the immediate result will be relief, but that is not usually how the process unfolds. The first experience is often discomfort. There is a strange sense that something important is being neglected. The mind, having spent months or years monitoring another person's decisions, suddenly finds itself without a familiar task. The urge to intervene remains strong. You think about sending one more message, having one more conversation, offering one more piece of advice that might finally make the difference. The old habit does not disappear overnight because it was never just a behavior. It was a way of relating to the world. It was a way of feeling useful, responsible, and involved. Stepping away from that pattern can feel unsettling at first because the mind interprets the absence of control as a form of risk. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." The discomfort is real, but much of it comes from the belief that letting go is dangerous when, in reality, it may be the first step toward freedom. This discomfort surprises many people. They expect freedom to feel immediately comfortable, yet freedom often arrives with uncertainty. For a long time, attention had somewhere to go. There was always a problem to analyze, a situation to predict, or a person to worry about. That constant engagement created a sense of purpose, even when it was exhausting. Without it, there is space, and space can feel unfamiliar. The mind starts searching for something to manage, because management has become a habit. It wants to return to the familiar cycle of observation, concern, and intervention. Yet if you resist that impulse, even briefly, something interesting begins to reveal itself. The world does not collapse. The disasters you imagined do not automatically arrive. The people you worried about continue making their own choices, just as they always have. Life moves forward. Reality continues operating without your constant supervision. As this realization settles in, another change quietly takes place. The tension that once felt normal begins to loosen. You notice it in small ways first. The endless mental rehearsals start becoming less frequent. You spend less time replaying conversations in your head, less time constructing arguments that will never be delivered, less time imagining how another person should be behaving. The mind becomes quieter, not completely silent, but quieter than before. There is less resistance, less friction, less of that exhausting internal struggle that comes from trying to control outcomes that were never controllable. What once consumed enormous amounts of energy begins losing its hold, and in its place, something valuable starts emerging. The best word for that experience is space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to notice aspects of life that were previously hidden behind constant concern. When attention is no longer monopolized by another person's journey, it naturally begins returning to the present moment. Things that once seemed unimportant suddenly become visible again. A morning becomes just a morning instead of an opportunity to worry. A conversation becomes just a conversation instead of an evaluation. A relationship becomes an experience to participate in rather than a project to manage. This shift may appear subtle from the outside, but internally it changes everything. The mind stops standing in constant opposition to reality and starts meeting reality where it actually exists. This is where acceptance begins revealing its true meaning. Many people misunderstand acceptance because they confuse it with approval. They assume that accepting reality means agreeing with everything that happens or pretending that harmful behavior is acceptable. That is not what acceptance means. Acceptance simply means seeing clearly. It means recognizing what is currently true without demanding that it become different before you allow yourself peace. A person can accept reality while still preferring that things improve. A person can acknowledge someone's flaws without becoming consumed by the need to eliminate them. Acceptance is not passivity, it is accuracy. It is the refusal to waste energy arguing with facts that already exist. The Stoics understood this distinction better than most. They recognized that much of human suffering comes not from reality itself, but from the ongoing conflict with reality. The mind creates an image of how things should be and then spends years fighting what actually is. This conflict drains enormous amounts of energy because reality always possesses the final word. No amount of frustration changes a fact. No amount of resistance alters the present moment. Yet people continue exhausting themselves in battles against circumstances that have already arrived. The wisdom of acceptance lies in recognizing that peace becomes possible the moment resistance stops being mistaken for strength. What makes this particularly powerful is that acceptance often improves relationships in ways that constant intervention never could. When people no longer feel judged, they become easier to understand. When they no longer feel managed, they become easier to appreciate. Their strengths become more visible because attention is no longer fixed exclusively on their shortcomings. Their humanity becomes easier to see because they are no longer being compared against an imagined version of who they should be. The relationship begins existing in the present rather than in a future that may never arrive. This creates a sense of ease that many people have not experienced in years. Something else happens as well. The emotional burden starts becoming lighter, not because the people around you suddenly change, but because your relationship to their choices changes. You stop feeling responsible for outcomes that belong to someone else. You stop carrying consequences that are not yours. You stop measuring your own well-being against another person's progress. This shift creates a surprising sense of freedom. Energy that was once trapped in cycles of worry begins returning. Attention becomes available again. Life starts feeling less crowded by concerns that never truly belong to you. The remarkable thing is that peace was never waiting for another person to become different. It was never hiding behind their transformation, their realization, or their improvement. It was available the entire time, obscured only by the belief that reality needed to change before peace could exist. The moment that belief begins fading, something fundamental changes. The struggle loses its purpose. The constant tension loses its fuel. And in that quiet space where resistance once lived, a calmer and more grounded way of living finally has room to emerge. One of the great ironies of human relationships is that influence often becomes strongest at the exact moment we stop chasing it. For years, many people exhaust themselves trying to guide, persuade, correct, and improve those around them. They search for better arguments, better explanations, better strategies. They believe that if they can just communicate more effectively, they will finally create the change they have been hoping to see. Yet the harder they push, the more resistance they often encounter. Advice becomes noise, encouragement becomes pressure, concern becomes interference. What they intended as support begins producing the opposite effect. Then something unexpected happens. They stop. Not because they no longer care, but because they finally understand the limits of their role. As Epictetus taught, no man is free who is not master of himself. And once that constant effort to manage others disappears, attention returns to the only place where true mastery is possible. From there, the entire dynamic begins to change. At first, the change is subtle. There are no dramatic announcements, no grand declarations. Life simply becomes quieter. The endless attempts to direct another person's path fade into the background. Energy that was once spent monitoring other people begins returning to its source. Attention shifts inward, priorities become clearer. Instead of focusing on who someone else should become, a person starts asking more demanding questions of themselves. How can I become more disciplined? How can I become more patient? How can I become more reliable, more focused, more grounded? These questions produce a different kind of effort. Unlike the effort spent managing others, this effort creates visible results. Progress begins appearing not in someone else's life, but in your own. Human beings notice this more than most people realize. They may ignore advice, but they pay attention to examples. They may resist instruction, but they observe behavior. They watch how someone responds under pressure. They notice consistency. They notice discipline practiced quietly over long periods of time. They notice a person who continues moving forward without constantly demanding recognition. These observations often occur without discussion. No announcement is required. No lesson is delivered. People simply see what is happening. They compare it to their own experience, and something begins taking shape in the background of their mind. This happens because examples carry a kind of credibility that words alone rarely possess. Anyone can describe a principle. Anyone can explain what should be done. Living according to those principles is different. Living them requires commitment. It requires repetition. It requires the willingness to embody ideas long before they produce visible rewards. When people encounter someone who has genuinely done that work, they feel the difference immediately. The message no longer exists only in language. It exists in behavior. It exists in habits. It exists in the way that person moves through ordinary moments. There is a quiet authority that develops when actions consistently support words, and that authority cannot be manufactured through persuasion. The Stoics understood this deeply. They recognized that wisdom loses much of its power when it remains purely theoretical. Philosophy was never intended to be something spoken about endlessly. It was meant to be practiced. A person's character was the evidence. Their conduct was the proof. Their response to adversity revealed far more than any speech ever could. This is why the Stoics spent so much time examining themselves rather than attempting to reform everyone around them. They knew that genuine influence begins with example, not because examples guarantee results, but because they are the only form of influence that respects another person's freedom while still offering guidance. Something interesting often happens when this shift becomes consistent. People who once ignored advice begin asking questions on their own, not everyone, not always, but often enough to notice. Curiosity appears naturally where resistance once existed. The difference is important. Curiosity opens doors, pressure closes them. When someone arrives with a question of their own, they are no longer defending their position. They are exploring possibilities. They are receptive. They are interested. They are participating willingly in the process. That willingness changes everything because growth that is chosen tends to last far longer than growth that is imposed. Many people spend years trying to create this outcome through force. They push harder when they should step back. They explain more when they should demonstrate more. They become frustrated when their efforts fail because they mistake control for influence. The two are not the same. Control seeks compliance. Influence inspires consideration. Control attempts to direct another person's actions. Influence simply presents an example and allows the other person to decide what to do with it. One creates dependence and resistance. The other preserves autonomy and encourages reflection. Lasting change almost always emerges from the second path rather than the first. This perspective creates a profound sense of freedom. You stop carrying responsibilities that never belong to you. You stop feeling obligated to rescue every person from every mistake. You stop believing that wisdom can be forced into existence through persistence alone. Instead, you focus on becoming the kind of person whose life reflects the values they claim to believe in. There is something powerful about that simplicity. It removes unnecessary struggle and redirects attention toward what can actually be improved. In the end, the most meaningful influence rarely comes from trying to change people. It comes from showing them what is possible. It comes from living in a way that quietly demonstrates another path. Some will notice. Some will not. Some will become curious. Others will continue as they are. That part has never been yours to decide. What remains yours is the example you set, the character you develop, and the life you build. And when those things are pursued with sincerity and consistency, they often speak more clearly than any advice ever could. The moment you stop carrying lives that were never yours to carry, something extraordinary happens. Your hands become free. Your mind becomes clearer. Your energy returns to the one place where it has always had the power to create real change. Your own life. Other people will continue making their choices, walking their paths, and learning their lessons in their own time. But you no longer have to lose yourself waiting for them to become someone else. If this message resonated, take a moment to continue the journey. One of the videos on the screen right now will help you go even deeper into the Stoic principles that strengthen inner peace, self-mastery, and freedom from what you cannot control. Choose the one that speaks to you most. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, protect your peace, govern your mind, and remember, the quality of your life will always be shaped more by what you choose to carry than by what you choose to let go.